Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Aspiring People Ops Leaders event. That's a mouthful, isn't it? With Perry. Let me introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Abby. I work with the Aspiring People Ops Leaders community and the other 15-ish communities, all of which are run by RecWorks. RecWorks are a tech recruitment company with a massive difference. So obviously we're always on the lookout for more clients, and some of our best clients have come from community members who recommended us to their talent team. So if you are hiring for a new team or you're working for a company that is, we would love to hear from you. And if you want to know more about what we can offer, just ping me a message on LinkedIn or Slack or Twitter. My name is, as you see it on the screen, and I would love to point you in the right direction to take that conversation further. So what's the difference, I hear you ask? Well, also, as a company, we believe that recruitment really can be a force for good in the industry beyond just placing people in jobs. We have a massive commitment to learning, mentoring, and personal development, and that is where all of our communities and events come in. So if people want to learn and others want to share their knowledge, we are more than happy to connect you through our communities and events like this one today. We see this as giving back to those we have worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. Last year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor program, which does what it says on the tin. You can meet a mentor or you can be a mentor as well through that group. We're really excited about how many introductions we've made there, and we're looking forward to our 5,000th introduction through that community. As I've already said, we love to give opportunities for people to connect, and this event is part of that. If you'd like to know more about any of our other communities, again, ping me a message and we can take it from there. Or if you know Helen, Lewis or Barry, you can ping them a message and they'll be able to introduce you as well. The recording of today's session will be available for you on YouTube. I will put the link to the channel in the chat. And Perry has already said to me that if you have any questions as we're going through this evening, feel free to unmute and ask. This is a very informal session, so please do feel free to ask any questions that crop up as we go through. But with no further ado, let me hand over to Perry. Over to you.
Thank you, Abby. That was a very comprehensive overview and introduction. Much appreciated. So thanks for joining us, folks, at this point in the day. I hope you've had a good one. And today you've still got a tiny bit of brain power left for us to have a look into the future. Before we kind of went on air, Abby and I were talking about ChatGPT. Now, if you've not come across that yet, then you will soon, because it's that kind of chatbot AI kind of interface. Now, when I kind of first cut this deck and program, when we had a little go before Christmas and everybody was really busy partying, ChatGPT wasn't really a thing, and now it is. So you won't see that in here, but I just thought I'd mention that because it was kind of interesting how quickly the world changes. So I'll pop my slides up so that those who are watching on demand have got a little bit of something rather than just me going blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so what we're talking about is this new model, or a potential new model as I see it, for HR, and a kind of an evolution of the people profession. And with you being aspiring people ops leaders, one hopes that what you see is either a direct connection to HR as a kind of professional fraternity that you have a lot to do with, or that you're moving into that area yourself, or it encompasses all the practices and sort of systems and processes you use anyway. So a little bit about me in terms of an introduction. So I'm from Northamptonshire. I'm a chartered member of CIPD and fellow of the RSA. I founded People in Transformational HR Limited, which is what PTHR means, not my initials, in 2012. So we just had our 10-year celebration. In the last 5 years, I've been on the most influential thinkers list from HR Magazine, which is brilliant. And last year I made #1. So that was nice. Thank you. Written a couple of books. I do some lecturing and work with universities and academic institutions, again in the HR and kind of workspace. I'm a LinkedIn learning instructor, so there's a couple of lessons I've got there about HR. I'm also very heavily into unorthodox, flat, progressive, alternative working systems, and I sort of managed to flex that into a learning program last year. So I'm now a SEMCO style Institute qualified expert. And if any of you know the story of a Brazilian engineering company in the 1980s and 90s run by Ricardo Semler, he wrote the book Maverick. They broke all the rules and became a more successful and sustainable business because he got rid of layers of management, and it was lots of self-directed working and learning. A couple of TEDx's out there, so you can find me if you want to YouTube, Google and LinkedIn me. That's enough about me. And then just a bit about the company. We're a Certified BCorporation. We are a climate positive organisation. We're a 4-day week employer, so we don't work on Wednesdays. We signed the Menopause Pledge. We're a living wage organisations, and we kind of collect badges, as you can see. And so we have this kind of mission of better business for a better world, because we like the thought of business being a force for good, and with political unrest and so on, I'm not sure we can rely on that. And our mission really is to transform teams and the way they operate to help people flourish in their work. Flourishing is a really, really important kind of North Star for us. Now, how do we do it? Change and innovation, autonomous working, very hot on the energy factor of people and the systems that both deplete and should then regenerate that energy in people. We operate a lot with design and systems thinking, if you know those kind of methodologies. We are very much into the next stage of org design. And we like businesses to have that kind of consciousness about their model. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are things that both we practice in and kind of hope to steer more organisations towards. And who do we do that with? These are the sort of brands that we've got a footprint within, ranging from financial services to charities. And you can see I order them in colour sequence because I'm a bit obsessed like that. Same with my bookcase behind, as you can see. So yeah, all sizes, all denominations. Most of the work we do is through HR teams, transformation, change, capability, talent, all those kind of things. Always really good. I often say to people, I'm really lucky because the people who come to me from organisations like this have got such good intent, and they're a joy to work with. Right, let's get into it then. So the first thing we'll do is what has been called now by the World Economic Forum a polycrisis. So that word wasn't about last year, but it was coined at Davos recently. And it's all of this stuff. We've heard about VUCA, we've heard even about BANI, this brittle, anxious, non-linear and incomprehensible world, but it feels like it's actually more befitting to use the acronym MIND. It's multi-layered, so there are all sorts of scales and implications of it. It's all interconnected, but equally it's nuanced, and it is incredibly dynamic. And it's all these things. It's almost like, if one's not enough, you know, we've got about 9 or 10 of them to deal with. Cybercrime, potential $25 billion industry, if you can call it that. We never really know where the next kind of crisis comes from in terms of economics, with the interest rates only today going up and stuff like that. And the UK showing degrowth when everybody else is showing growth. So that's not a good place to be in. But anyway, so that's the kind of backdrop to a lot of this. I mean, it is quite literally like, well, we've got to do something different because all of these things are urging us to change and shift and adapt. Talking of change and shift and adapt, if we go back to the future and we went to time travel in the DeLorean and we went back to the 1800s, we would see something that isn't HR really, but it was called worker welfare. And it was operating largely in benevolent organisations like Rowntree, Cadbury, and all sorts of other large employers who said, actually, these people who do work for us, we don't just need to give them wages, we'll give them housing, education, healthcare. And so this was the kind of beginning, I suppose, of a different kind of contract with organisations. Not everybody did it, of course, but it was the beginning of the realisation that people were beyond commodities as a sort of an industrial age outcome. And then talking of industrial, we then kind of moved into industrial relations. And if you are old enough like I am, you will remember things like the Winter of Discontent, and you'll think about lots of strikes, but hello, they're back again. So this was really where it was a kind of union leadership kind of struggle with people in the middle who were not necessarily known as HR practitioners at the time, but would kind of broker pay deals and terms and conditions and so on. But during the sort of 70s and 80s, that became personnel, which sounds like a very militaristic kind of term, but that's what it became because it was about contracts and recruitment, and it was about learning and development. Those things came into the equation a lot more because of the recognition, really, that people had potential that you could unleash and career paths. But then HR came in really in the sort of late 80s, early 90s as a slightly Americanized concept of personnel, but talking much more about culture and values, and started to expand, I suppose, the operating sort of sphere of HR from transactional to perhaps a bit more psychological and a little bit more motivational. Now we see a lot of people and culture. Now the people and culture frame, it has permeated through to job roles. So you have chief people officers now, not just HR directors or even chief HR officers. And you do see people with people and culture a lot more in business partnering and those kind of roles. So we've seen that kind of sophisticated, I suppose you say, more humanly language now start to come in. But the profession is still largely called HR because of that kind of, I suppose, like lawyers are also, you know, barristers and advocates and agents and notaries and all those kind of other permutations. But really what we're seeing now is a sort of flip back to worker welfare, notwithstanding the recent kind of tech layoffs, which have been both brutal and insensitively handled in many ways. But we've seen for a long time now people looking at well-being, inclusion, the whole sense of activism and voice. And so we're now seeing organisations who are in dialogue with their workforce, who are saying things like, what is our environmental footprint like? How do we know our supply chain is free from slavery and extractive polluting practices and so on? So yeah, so we've got that kind of tension, I suppose you'd say now, but it feels like it's flipped back. It is more about duty of care and looking after, and COVID obviously has had a lot to do with that. So that's the kind of trail, I suppose, of what we call HR and people. And within it, lots of tools and policies and shifts in the way people are remunerated, I can never say that, remunerated, developed, all sorts of things, schemes and what have you. Now, if you zoomed into the HR kind of operating arena, this is still fairly predominantly the model of operating for HR. And it was conceived by University of Michigan professor called Dave Ulrich. And Dave Ulrich had done a lot of work from the personnel to HR shift and saw the need to create some more distinct ways to frame the HR activities based on a slightly more sophisticated business footprint and the emergence of things like internet technologies and so on and so forth. So what he decreed was that we would split the function in three ways, but they were interconnected. So you would have administrative shared service support, and that would be largely around things like recruiting contract signs and interpensionable contributions and payroll and administration largely. So I guess what personnel was really for. And then something called a centre of excellence, which would be learning and development, organisation design, it would be pay modelling and those sort of areas. And this was where people who had very specialist skills, some were psychologists, some were perhaps data analysts, would operate within a sort of a briefing approach where somebody would say, right, we need an apprenticeship programme, and the centre of excellence would do the research, design, deployment on that. And then to make sure it was business aligned, Ulrich's big shift was to create the role of HR business partners, who were largely there to translate HR into operational activities and to receive requests and changes and alterations on how the business was now headed. So, for example, if you worked in an energy company, you would probably have business partners who were looking at helping people recruit engineers, but also train engineers. And then maybe there weren't enough female engineers coming in. So the business partners would take that brief from the leaders and say, OK, so we want to diversify. That's a very sensible thing to do. We can recruit from a larger pool. We will take that as a project and we'll make that happen for you in your domain. So it's kind of business led. HR sort of facilitated, and they might go to the Centre of Excellence to design campaigns, and the Shared Service Centre would run recruitment and selection processes of that nature and analyse the data. So that's the model that probably still applies in, I would say, something like probably 90% of reasonably sized HR teams around the world. But as we see, 1997, I mean, internet was still quite new. Google was probably not even that present at that particular time. So this was a model of its time that has adapted and has shifted somewhat. But I had an agitation about 5-6 years ago that we ought to have something different. And so this was my attempt in a book I wrote in 2017, published in later in 2017. The book was called Transformational HR. So I thought, well, let's see what transformational HR might look like then. And I deliberately wanted to go away from verticals and delineation and perhaps handoff type of process to create more intersectionality, more fluidity, and more responsiveness, because HR's had a number of critical appraisals of it in its time, because it's seen as an overly bureaucratic function. It's quite limiting in some respects. It isn't responsive enough and modern and adaptive. So I thought this could be a chance to unhook some of that and create a lot more domain-based expertise, but still connected to other disciplines. So, for example, if we look at something like diversity and inclusivity, we are already seeing some people who are recruited directly to the role of an EDI business partner or an EDI kind of centre of excellence practitioner, when in reality it links so strongly to things like the employee experience, to your employer brand, to your reward mechanics, gender pay gap as an example, and so on, your talent acquisition routines, your learning and development, your leadership development. So it links to more than just one job. So somebody could hold that responsibility, but they'll have to enlist and work with a number of others when it comes to different kind of products and services that HR needs to provide for the type of business that it's in. So that was my attempt to kind of unpick it a bit and reassemble it a bit. So maybe it's not transformational, but I think when I read the book, it kind of was. So people were sometimes a little bit taxed, but also some quite enthused by it. So from the sort of tentacles I've put out into the world, I know of about 40 organisations of varying sizes who operate largely in this model. One's a very large professional services organisation in Northern Europe. So we're talking about 15, 20,000 people. Now, the thing they liked most about this model was the fact that there's a very specific place for transformative activities. So you've got research, future experience, change, future skills, people strategy, talent development, all kind of sitting in a sort of trajectory based, almost like bring the arc of the future a bit nearer by being more competent and capable about designing your future, not just reacting to what happens around you. And they're really active on that. So they've got strong kind of data analytics and technology linked practices in that HR team. So they've really sort of flexed their muscles in that transformative space. But it didn't like change the world. I mean, I didn't expect it to, but I think it's kind of given me a platform to think about, maybe if that's not next, maybe that's a transition. So what is next? And all of those absolute polycrisis elements actually form an incredibly, almost ironic mnemonic. So the concept of eudaimonia links to what I talked about flourishing at the very start of this presentation. And it's a 5th century BC Greek term, and it means flourishing. It means experiencing joy. It's not fleeting happiness, and it's not kind of hedonistic satisfaction. It is, I'm flourishing in life because I am who I am. I know what I'm here to do. I know who I'm here with. I know what makes me strong and enlightened and capable and warm and positive. So it's almost like this sense of actualization, which was in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you remember that. But again, rather than just some kind of pinnacle thing that nobody ever gets to, there are really a kind of scale of eudaimonic kind of sensations as you develop as an adult. But it spells out economics, unity and inclusion, digitization, agility, information, morals and ethics, outputs, net zero carbon, innovation and adaptiveness. It almost like feels like the playbook for now. So instead of a PESTLE analysis, you know, political, environmental and social, technological, legal and something else, let's go eudaimonic, and it means flourishing anyway. So I think that's quite poetic. And there's some text about what we mean by those, but we are seeing people get much more animated and activated by things like regenerative economics and not so much chasing profit, but shareholder value, not the only thing, stakeholder value becoming a lot more of the sort of, I guess you'd say, tone of now. Tech, as we talked about ChatGPT at the beginning of this, but Web3, decentralized, blockchain, Bitcoin, you name it, there's plenty going on in that space. Purposeful work around the planet. I think we're a lot more aware now that it's a climate emergency, not just change, and so on. So, you know, agile operating systems, ethical practices, ESG as a kind of catch-all for how we need to operate. Planning people in a strategic sense, so we don't just have to go on recruitment kind of hamster wheels, but we can get much more deliberate about who we bring in and how we skill people and what we look for, and new capabilities, not just digitization, but empathy, compassion, human skills, those kind of things. So big shift, alt, delete kind of reboot, I think, for almost all the operating systems we know about. Now, in 2021, we were still in the midst of lockdown and the height of the sort of pandemic uncertainty. And I was seeing McKinsey, EY, Gartner, you name it. Everybody was flooding the world with this is what the future works like because of the pandemic, and this is what it will be like when we emerge from it. And it was all getting a bit confusing and it was all a bit overwhelming. So instead of just trying to pick the one truth in it, I took all of them and smashed them together to try and create an amalgamated truth, I suppose you'd say. So I researched about 45, 50 reports, all sorts of research papers, thought pieces, you name it. It wasn't just me, there was a small team I was working with, and we created the HR outputs from that. So we called it the State of HR 21, and we said, these are the kind of important things now, and this is where we're pivoting and so on. Now, the most interesting thing for me was analysing what people said the skills were needed for HR from 2021 onwards, and for people in people and leading roles. And this is the kind of amalgamated top 10 of those from 21. Now, we're going to do another one this year, and we will see how some of these have perhaps shifted. So look out for that around about the middle of the year. Performance analytics, value creation, psychology. They're a different set of skills to what I would describe most HR practitioners particularly exude with confidence and prominence. Some are already there, like org design is obviously a sort of an HR type practice. Psychology of learning, I guess that's just a particular bent on the learning game. But what we realise from this is that there's a very different skill set already starting to emerge, and the likelihood is over the next 3, 4, 5 years, these are not just going to be emerging, they're going to be active, and people are going to need to have them in order to practice HR in a much more turbulent, complex, uncertain and eudaimonic world. So that gave me something to build some, I guess, capability thought on in terms of what HR professionals might look like. Now, also during the pandemic, well, you get a bit of time on your hands sometimes. I'd looked around at people experience models. They were all very complex about, kind of the trail of the employee life cycle, and they were very uniquely crafted towards the organization. And I couldn't find anything that was just on a page, simple enough, diagnostic, but also design oriented, that kind of said, if you've got these things all clicking really well, you're likely to flourish. So I put it together, road tested it a bit, and it's starting to get some traction, and we're using it in a lot of the consulting work we do. And it, every time we can, we kind of test it out. And the premise of the model says organizations exist to create value. I mean, that doesn't mean to say you stack up cash, because if you're a government organization, you're there to run a civic borough, or you're there to run a government department. Now, you need money to do that, but your purpose isn't to make money. Your purpose is to serve a community or a society or whatever it is. But there's value in that. There's value, there's accessibility, there's opportunities, there's whatever. Now, that's linked to what we as individuals value in life. Now, that's not, again, to say it's monetary value, but it's what's important to us. So, for example, if what's important to you is a yacht and, several really nice cars and Gucci shoes and lots of holidays, then what you value clearly are high-end luxury goods and experiences. And you're probably going to end up working in a company where there's a lot of money being made, because that's what you'd need to fuel that life cycle, that lifestyle. But if you valued teaching people who had difficulties in learning because either you did or a relative did, and you've got a real passion for it, then you'll probably work in a local authority helping children with special needs learn how to, do things. And there won't be much money in that, but you're not going into it because there's much money, because what you value is what you're doing. So that's a very important alignment start point, because there's a lot of people who are doing things and they probably haven't answered the question, is this what I value in life, or is it just to earn some money? So I think there's something in that kind of helps create this engaging trail, in this whole sense that you're not likely to flourish if you're just working somewhere to be economically sound, unless what you value in life is just to be economically sound. That's probably going to be all right. But we're normally a bit more sophisticated than that. So there's meaning for the individual, there's meaning for the organization, and they all come together for a reason for being. There's a reason for being that the organization exists and you come to it. So that's getting quite philosophical, but it's a really good point to start. Now, if we follow the model across, you've got systems, working systems, technology systems, process systems, economic systems, you name it. There are systems that help us get from a point of aspiration to a point of delivery on a product, service, or whatever it is. But again, what most models of people experience don't touch on is the energy of us. Because if we're in a good place with good systems and good people, and we believe in what we're doing, then likely our energy is pretty good for what we do, even if there's a lot of it and we're quite tired. However, lots of places, our energy is completely zapped because we're working in frictious systems with toxic relationships, with awful processes, with terrible support and tools. And that's energy draining. And we probably go home at the end of the day and just collapse. And then we recharge overnight, sleep, get up, do it again. That's a bit of a Groundhog Day thing. So the concept of work as a regenerative energy principle is where you absolutely love it. You're committed to it, devoted to it. It gives you a kick. And you might actually be physically tired, but in a spiritual sense, you are quite recharged by what's going on with your work. So those two kind of underpin and overarch it. And then in the middle of these boxes are about how we design the nature of jobs and work and systems and flow and decision making and so on. And the principles, that might be the values and part of the culture. So it's the kind of, how does it feel? What's important to us beyond rules, guidance, legislature? You know, what's our code of conduct? What's our esprit de corps? And then accountability, clarity, together. All the other boxes are where we manifest things that we do as part of our work. So I'm accountable for this role and these people and this team and this compliance. Clarity, I'm really clear about what success looks like. I'm clear if there's a violation, what happens. I'm clear that if there's a problem to solve, I've got the ability to make decisions, that kind of thing. And then togetherness, you know, we're unified, we get it, we support each other, and it doesn't matter your background or protected characteristics, you know, we're kind of in it. And then development, recognition, influence, and inclusion are kind of HR space, because we teach people, we reward them and give them kudos. There's influence in terms of participating in surveys and decision making. And then there's inclusion, which is about equity and fairness and justice. Now, if all those things are in, you're likely to feel fulfilled. You're likely to care about what you do and people care about you and the organization cares about you, and you're probably pretty well. Mentally balanced, physically okay, all pretty good, you're flourishing. If not, work from right to left and find out where the failure is, and then think about what you can do to put that right in order for it to then flow through. So that model is something we're using, and it got me thinking about those skills. So what I did was I kind of mapped some of the skills that are needed in these parts of the people experience to think, how can HR and leadership teams and so on develop, deliver, and sustain this kind of model, so more people have a good chance of flourishing. Now, the meaning making side of things, if I go back to the list there it is at number 8, meaning makers. And people are like, well, what's a meaning maker? It's somebody who can very, very strongly hold and articulate and strengthen purpose, the vision, the values, and everything that's really pertinent to the almost essence of what an organization is there to do, and calibrate that to people so that people know what they're here to do and so on. Relationship stewards, so that you've got people all interconnected and it's all fair and equitable. Practice leads who know specialist things and can coach and guide people. Psychologists who understand the interoperation of humans in teams and everything else. People who design the systems, people who manage the products, people who operate the processes, the technology, and so on. And then people who analyze and say, is it performing well? Are people in good places? Have we got repeatable habits, behaviors, and systems? And what does it actually achieve in terms of value? So I thought, well, if they're perhaps the domains of perhaps a new type of people professional, and perhaps even, you know, sort of team leaders can pick up some of this, and functional heads and so on. I thought, how does it map? So I kept using my 4 interlocking circles, but in a very different construct here. So I called it HR 3.0 because I thought, well, it's kind of trendy to connect it to Web 3.0, and it maybe will need to happen when that kind of technology really gets a grip on us. Supported by people ops, really, I guess you'd say, manifested through practice leads who are really good at recruitment selection, industrial relations, those kind of things. The meaning makers and the relationship kind of stewards at the heart of it, kind of pulling it all together and keeping the essence right. But it needs strong systems designers to continually adapt the way we work, both technologically and process-wise and everything else. Psychologists who can really make sense of, well, this is what people are like now, this is what's really important to people now, this is how we leverage things like, you know, fair and equitable reward. Analysts who check it all out, make sure it's all tuned and doing well, and the product managers who literally build everything that comes from all of those. So policies, programs, systems, schemas, direction, guidance, whatever it might be. So these are people who actually build HR and learning related products. So what does that need, and what does it do? So I kind of had a little think about not just kind of job description, but almost like the essence of where do people get information and tools and things they can utilize, and what do they build as a result of it? So the meaning makers, as an example, they use the company's reason for being and people's kind of reason for wanting to work there, the strategic vision for what's going to look like, the business model, you know, are we outsourced, are we global, are we local? The impact narrative, so what we're set up to do, and that's not just acquire profit, but, you know, potentially do good for the world and give back and be a good corporate citizen and change the nature of an industry. The prosperity criteria, so that's really, again, going beyond just purely financial reporting and thinking about your environmental impact and your human impact and your intellectual impact on the world. And then the kind of clarity of relationships. So really, what do we need here? How do we interoperate? What's our kind of code of honor? And from that, they can produce the people proposition, the kind of people, culture, and OD strategy, these ESG parameters, and strengthen relationships and trust and belief, which is clearly something that I think most companies say they need a really good dollop of improvement on, to provide the kind of essential vibrancy, I suppose, of almost like the climate, the cultural climate of how an organization operates. Then when we get a bit more technical, the systems designers and the product managers will say, well, give me that. And what I'll do is I'll produce some artifacts and some assets and some realizable things that help the company exist. So the org design, the operating model, how your processes work, almost like your inventory of resource. So your assets, physical, digital, intellectual, that kind of thing. And then the sort of performance infrastructure, really, it's like, well, how do we optimize it? How do we know it's doing really well in all the ways we want it to? And where do we tune it up if we're not doing as well in certain areas? And the whole kind of sense of well-being too, a kind of a well-being group of people often will have a wellness kind of ripple out effect on the organization. So the organization will feel well, and that it's sustainable, that it's got a kind of spirit. And then the product managers build all the things really that kind of come out from that. So the kind of final consumables, I suppose you'd say, that people will need. So, you know, if you are entering into parenting, they will build the kind of maternity, paternity, family leave kind of guidance, and the vouchers for childcare, and the connections to communities, and the links to education, whatever it might be, all the things that help you with those like life episodes and things that happen and that are pertinent and relevant in organizational life. So, you know, somebody steals from the company, somebody defames the company, you need those kind of things as well to make sure you can maintain company reputation. You know, Volkswagen diesel scandal, Wells Fargo rounding up, all that kind of stuff still happens. So they'll need to design processes and systems that kind of trap those not nice things you want to happen, but also all the enabling things that help people as they go through life with different kind of, like I say, episodes and needs. So they're going to be busy people, because they are going to be sort of refreshing and I guess you'd say constantly adapting the kind of product offer that people are now expecting a workplace to be all about. So perhaps if we had good product managers around layoffs and redundancies at places like Google and stuff, we wouldn't have the absolute terrible situations we had where people didn't even know they were sacked and their security pass just didn't work on the gate. It's like, whoa, that's a nice way to tell me. You know, they'd have designed something much better than that. Okay, so then the psychologists and analysts lacking big time in the HR world at the moment, and no disrespect to people who have got psychology qualifications who are in roles, but we kind of don't call it out. We kind of squeeze it into some kind of center of excellence role or something. I think we just need to liberate people as psychologists within this model for two and maybe even three reasons. One, because I think the science, the evidence, and the I guess the kind of research on human behaviors and tendencies and so on is constantly needing updating. And so we need somebody to hold that space and go, oh, this is how we need to be, because this is how people have recalibrated what they expect when it comes to fair treatment or whatever. But then also I think there's two other elements to it. One is to provide internal psychological support for people who are hitting burnout, who are really struggling with their home relationships and struggling with financial well-being and so on. I mean, it's nice to have apps and stuff you can do that with, but I think having a psychologist who understands the impact on your behavior that you've got internally to access is a very, very strong thing to offer people as a kind of duty of care factor. But then HR people who are confronted with people who have, damaged the company, who have stolen, who have abused their situation, who have been abused, and all sorts of horrible things that happen to people, are often HR's the first point of call. And in many cases, not at all qualified to deal with an almost like a counselling type of intervention at that sort of point. And so often what happens is there's referral and experts are brought in, I know that. But you've still got perhaps the passing on of trauma to you, and therefore you've got a vicarious kind of trauma to then deal with. And at the moment, there's no release support and guidance unless the HR person then presses the OC health button and goes and gets some counselling themselves. But it's kind of part of the job, but it's probably a little bit too strong unless you are hugely capable in a psychological frame of operating. Same with analysts, data, research, trails. I've seen some really good HR teams who've got some strong analytic capabilities, and their reputation in their organizations is sky high because they absolutely know the impact. If you make a decision about banning overtime, what the result of that's going to mean from a kind of analytic point of view, not just a cost point of view. So they can help temper some of the perhaps more knee-jerk reactions that some execs might make, but also just generally keep the organization tuned and sustainable and not just perform at all costs and then suddenly collapse when things shift economically. And the people ops and practice leads are exactly what we need for those domains that are probably not going to go away, like engagement, rightly so, and recognition protocols, all sorts of things about resource utilization. So I think we've got people who can help us with strategic workforce planning, legalities, onboarding, stuff like that. That's not going to change. That's not going to go away. And so people holding that space gives us a really strong professional kind of anchoring point, and they will enlist designers if they need to change their onboarding. They'll enlist analysts if they need to check the kind of cost per head of recruitment campaigns and so on. So that's the sort of toolkit and the inputs and potentially some of the outputs. And how do we do it? It's a big ask for some HR teams to shift to something much more fluid and much less locked into those specific domains that we've got now. But we've got to get things like ambition and direction really strongly set. So you really need to say, have we got the appetite to decouple from an existing HR model? Do we think it's absolutely right that we should make a big shift? And hopefully lots of people soon will say yes, because I think the existing model is going to come under increasing stress and strain. Pull transformation levers, liberate teams, get them to really build into these new services and acquire the capabilities and lean on their sort of corporate connections. So for product managers in HR, they could just work super strongly with product managers in tech, understand the discipline, apply it to non-tech solutions, and then get operational with it, and then make sure that we continually strengthen and really sort of build the interoperability, I suppose, of people who are in these particular domains. What does it look like as a scheme? I love a roadmap, so I thought, well, I'll have a go. So if I was in an organization, smallish organization, I mean, I think, we're talking probably where there's an HR team of at least 10 plus, I think you should be able to pivot on this within about 6-7 months. I don't see any reason why not if you really, really lean into it. It might take you longer to acquire a psychology degree, but you might not need that because you could create some kind of strengthened, outsourced, but in-house available occupational health solution that strengthens your psychological input, or just borrow a sort of contractor on demand type of situation. But anyway, if you're bigger, then I think you'd absolutely want to hardwire it and recruit psychologists in and give them a real psychologist domain to work in. But there's a kind of flow to this that I think is practical enough that if you're a large company, within 2 years, you should absolutely be able to pivot to a very, very different model. And I think what that would do symbolically to the rest of the organization is it should kind of unsettle them a bit that HR has been able to make such a leap and a transformation from where it was, but offer the opportunity for other functions to similarly do so, marketing and even finance and so on. I mean, it sounds silly that finance could transform to something a little bit more like this. But I think with the different value parameters we work to now, not just spreadsheet based financials, I think we've got to get cleverer in the financial domain within our organizations to report on things like social value, community value, natural value of the environment, and so on. So yeah, I think that's my kind of schema and plan. Abby, you got your hand up.
I have. It just it strikes me from some of the things you've been sharing so far, and especially the last kind of few slides, this is where it really helps, it does, I guess, to have people, for want of a better term, above you who really already know what your strengths and capabilities are, because then when you're shifting models, they can already see and suggest places that you could be useful, and you can say as a reflection of that whether that's something you think is accurate for you, and have that kind of conversation that's really constructive.
Yeah. Now that's a super question. And I can already point to the fact that I'm working with a client now, rather large, well-known high street brand. And what they're doing is they're absolutely sweating the talent assessment kind of area, because what they're recognizing is it is really rudimentary now, based on competency profiles and job descriptions and potential kind of succession plans and 9-box grids that are really out of date. And they want to go much deeper so that they're, I suppose, people leaders across the whole business, but starting with the HR and talent team, are quite literally versed as talent officers in a way that they understand adult psychology and adult maturity and development. And they think about things like, how do you spot potential and tendencies and link them then to emerging fields that perhaps haven't been quite well developed yet, but actually you probably need people who know enough about them to get into them to develop it themselves. So I think we've got a very different construct ahead of us, where we don't design jobs and fit people to them. We find people who can get the start of that job and design the rest of it themselves as they emerge into it and learn and research and absorb. So I know some people who do a lot of job crafting based approaches, and some of the financial sector's doing that now. And so, again, one client I work with is already starting to develop what they call centaur roles. They're customer agents who can also code, who can then build adaptations to customers' technology that they're using, so they don't have to pass it on to a help desk thing. So they are multi-skilled in that respect. So they're getting people who know a bit of both to prove how that works. Then you use those people as kind of archetypes, and they model the role, so you can then recruit more to it. And I saw something in the defense industry that I did, again, tiny bit of work with. 300 people in the world have a particular skill when it comes to a certain type of defense technology. 300 in the world, that's not many at all. So what they are clamoring to do is that they are literally trying to build academies around all 300 of those, to create 10 times the number of people who can do that, to then allow those people who built the academies to then push on and do the next iteration of what that kind of work looks like. So it almost feels like we're going to have roles who are pioneers, who are designing the future kind of thing. And if that sounds a bit, Jetsons and off the scale, I can't think of any other way we're going to do it. If you're in the boardroom, you're probably the least well-equipped person to design a role, because you're too distant from it, and you have no way of really being able to you've got to get people who are near to it, who can see what the pivot and the arc of the future is, and get them to build into it. So great question, Abby. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the roadmap. Just to give you a kind of reminder, so we're going to go from 3 kind of horizontals or verticals into much more interconnected and interplaying domains. But even those domains are built around products, systems, people, and processes. So that's the good news, is that we can kind of give it some simple domains there. However, we are looking at psychology, analysts, product managers, and so on, which is a massive, massive shift for HR, particularly because it's not in that game now. And in fact, I'm working with an HR director now. In the strategy, I put products. She went, "We don't do products." I went, "Yes, you do." She said, "No, we don't. The company make products." I'm like, "No, you make products." I said, how do you get people to build an apprenticeship scheme?" They're like, "Oh, that's a product." I'm like, "Of course it is. People consume it. They need to know where to find it. They need to know how to activate it, what the benefit of it is, how they play into it." So yeah, products, I think, is a really, really big dawning, I think, for the HR shift, and that we think more like people. So I guess people as employees are kind of consumers. If they had to pay for it, would they? Is it good enough that it gives them what they need? And then just a cheeky little Mandalorian reference. Is this the way? Well, this could be the way. And that's it for me. There's the team. and you can find us on various website type things. I'll stop there and just see if anybody's A, still awake, B, lost the will to live, C, got any questions. So yeah, cool. Well done for sticking with us.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating, Perry. So thank you so much.
Cool.
Does anybody have any questions for Perry?
Did it make sense? Have you?
Autumn says, awesome, thank you.
Oh, wicked. Oh, thank you. That's
so obviously it made sense enough. So that's good. That's always
brilliant.
Good.
Yeah, good.
And
you know, if we're thinking about plans, what am I doing with this model? Because it kind of came out of my head. Well, yeah, I've already socialized it a bit, so I'm doing more and more talks on it to kind of provoke it. I've bounced it off some of my most trusted senior HR professionals, one of whom said, now that's the HR I want to work in. So that's a good sign. And the other response that kind of made me laugh was, wow, how on earth are most HR teams going to get there? They think it's a real moonshot. So I've got to be prepared to get this to a point where people can see the baby steps and the kind of trajectory for this. So with that in mind, I am going to do some serialization of it, I suppose you'd say, to get it out into the world with HR Magazine. So we're going to put it as a regular with HR Magazine, and even find a place where we could kind of almost open source the model. So people come in, tinker with it, make their own version, play around with it, give us some feedback. Because these things do sound great in theory, but they need to hit the wild. They need to be tested. And so I don't know whether I've got it right, but I'm giving it a shot to see if it sparks what is right for people in terms of shifting. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to socialize it and see if we can crowdsource it a bit. Excellent. Great.
I had a quick question. Hi, Perry. It's
hello, Simon.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, when you've got short-term needs, you know, business needs to hit, you know, deadlines, etc., and then you're stuck with a lot of process.
Yeah.
To try, you know, so like the huge change management exercise, to try and change mindsets.
Yeah.
It's not just about capabilities, it's about mindset. It's also about where the business is at, and
totally that.
Are they ready for that? So how would you overcome that kind of sell the story internally, the value proposition, and get the business interested in this change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And you know what? Most of the work I do with HR teams is that they haven't got enough capacity. So I'm trying to help them with capacity creation. Yeah. Now, I think what's good about this as a destination, perhaps, is that capacity creation can perhaps take on a new shape or form. Because rather than just getting them on top of the workloads, you can actually get them on top of the workload and then reposition perhaps a function or a part of the domain that could never be the same again, and start the chain reaction to all these other things. So if nothing else, what I would encourage HR teams to do is know whether they need to beef up their analytics, beef up their products, or beef up their psychology, and just start with one of them. And then if that takes you a year before you get on something else, then build after that. It's classic kind of agile, but perhaps stretched out a bit stuff, really. I would be very surprised if any HR team was daring enough to kind of go, right, let's build it, and then kind of just go, woof, there we go. So I think there'll be a kind of parallel thing going on here. And that's why I think the 21-month time frame is where, you know, if I was like Santander and I liked it, I wouldn't want to press go straight away. I'd want to gradually get to it. But then in 21 months time, I want to look at it and go, it's really different now. So because I think with this, you've got to have a kind of checkered flag moment, and then press go on keeping that sustained and improved. So you're absolutely right, Sunil. And in fact, what I'm urging HR teams to do is just go, get yourself some capacity no matter what you do, whether you do this big or not, because they're running out of steam now, HR people. They're on burnout bad time and literally slithers away from collapse. So yeah, it needs to change. Yeah. Brilliant question. Thank you. I hope that gives you some confidence. Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Good stuff. Well, we were small but perfectly formed, I think, tonight, Abby.
Absolutely. I agree. Are there any other questions for Perry before I bring us to a close? I will take that as a no, in which case all that is left for me to say is thank you so much, Perry, for giving up your time and coming and sharing with us. It's absolutely brilliant to hear from you. So thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And if anybody's watching the recording, thank you for joining us later. It's great to have all of you. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our future events as well. And take care. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Cheers.